I am much more open to letting myself have feelings and letting them show because I think that we do way too much hiding of our emotions. A lot of people think that they shouldn't burden other people with their emotions. Well, guess what? I don't think other people's emotions are a burden. I think other people's emotions are a window into who they really are, into what matters. And so if I really believe that, and I do, then I have to be willing to put my money where my mouth is and show some of my emotions to other people.
Something I keep coming back to is how much we've been taught to treat our emotions like a problem to be solved, like they're in the way, like the goal is to feel less or at least look like you do. And I think that might be one of the most quietly damaging ideas in our culture. Because what if your emotions aren't the problem? What if they're actually trying to tell you something important about what you value, what you need, and who you are? That's the conversation we're having today. And I promise, it's going to change the way you think about every feeling you've ever wanted to push away. My guest today is Dr. Jennifer Veilleux, a clinical psychologist, professor, and researcher who has spent her career studying how people experience, regulate, and relate to their emotions. Dr. Jen has a way of making the science of emotions feel deeply personal, because for her, it is. She grew up watching people navigate emotions completely differently from each other, became fascinated by why, and turned that fascination into a body of research that is genuinely changing how we understand the emotional lives of human beings. She's also the author of a book that frames emotions as messages, not noise, not weakness, not something to suppress, but actual signals from your own brain telling you what matters. In our conversation today, we get into why emotions exist in the first place, what they're actually trying to tell us, the difference between feeling an emotion, regulating it, and avoiding it, and why those three things are not the same. We also talk about shame versus guilt, why venting might not be helping you as much as you think, and the one simple skill Dr. Jen says is the most important thing you can do to build a healthier relationship with your emotions. If you've ever felt like your emotions were working against you, this episode is going to reframe that completely. I'm your host, Ryan Olekson, and this is Beyond 80%. Dr. Jennifer Veilleux, welcome to Beyond 80%. We are so excited to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So we are going to talk about one of my all-time favorite topics, which is emotions. But before we jump into all the goodness around it, I want to understand first and give listeners an idea how you came to study emotions in such a deep way.
I've been interested in emotion for a long time, and I think some of that involves just looking around at people in my life. People seem to just navigate emotions really differently. So, in my family, my dad is very Norwegian, very kind of stoic, doesn't show a lot of emotion. My mom and sister are much more emotional. And when I was in college, I was really emotional, but I wasn't at home. And so I've just sort of been interested in how does this happen? How are people so different from each other emotionally? And then how can people be different in some situations or at one time point in their life than at other time points? So I think for me, research is me search. I look around and just saw all these differences in how people navigated emotion. And I wanted to know if there was some science there and if people were studying this. And they absolutely are.
So in your work, what did you notice about people and what do they struggle with the most when it comes to emotions?
I was interested in emotions before I came to grad school, but in grad school, in clinical psychology, we learn to become therapists. So we start seeing therapy clients. And that's when I really started thinking about emotion deeply, because as a therapist, you are privileged to be with people's emotions. A lot of people share emotions in therapy that maybe they don't share in a lot of other places because they don't know how to navigate their emotions, or they don't have people who they feel like they can share their emotions with without burdening them. And so I think for me, it was looking at people who I saw in therapy and hearing a lot about what people thought they shouldn't feel. I shouldn't feel this, or I shouldn't feel that. I shouldn't feel sad. I shouldn't feel angry. I mean, I hear this still all the time with the clients that I see. And that just doesn't make sense to me. Like, why would we have emotions that we shouldn't feel?
I really like the way that you position emotion as messages. And when you say that emotions are messages, they have a purpose. There's a compass almost ingrained in us with emotions. Can you help us unpack that a little bit more and explain what that means?
Yeah, so emotions have a purpose. They're functional. Humans have emotions, but so do animals. Pets, like you can see when they're happy, when they're sad. There's great videos out there. If you want to see a laughing rat, it's pretty great. They like tickle rats on the glass tables.
Oh, that's amazing.
I don't even like rats and it's still cute. But we know that emotions have a function. We have them for a reason. And so there's three main reasons that we have emotions. One is to facilitate communication. So emotions are meant to be shared, they're meant to be expressed because emotions can often give an idea of what's going on with a person much faster than words. So emotions are there to facilitate connection and communication. Emotions are also there to help prepare us for action. So most people have heard of the fight, flight, freeze response. Emotions change our physiology so that if we need to fight or attack or we need to run away really fast, emotions get our bodies ready to do those things. And then the third thing that emotions give us is knowledge. One of the things that I think is really important about this emotions as messages idea is that we cannot actually have an emotion about something that doesn't matter. So if an emotion is present, that means something matters. It doesn't mean the situation matters, right? I might stub my toe and be mad at myself that I stubbed my toe. I don't care that much about if I have a little bit of a bruise, but I might care that I'm the kind of inattentive person that like doesn't pay attention to where the door is. And so if we can tune into our emotions and the messages that they're giving us information about what matters and in what way things matter. And when we ignore emotions, we ignore a lot of source of self and knowledge about the world.
So this is something that I've been finding with my own therapy clients, that individually we attach meaning to emotions. Are there specific influences over that? I would assume if something were to happen to someone, say they went through trauma, that would obviously attach a meaning to it, which would come with that emotion. But are there other influences that can also affect those meanings that we attach to emotions?
Well, sure. We attach meaning to emotion all the time because emotions often happen in social contexts. Okay, if you get a message, there's the content of the message. And I think of the content of the message as like the kind of emotion that it is. We get different types of mail too. We get like bills, we get invitations. We also get mail from different people. And so who is sending the message? To me, and I talk about how who's sending the message are our values. And so you're talking about the meaning that we attach. And I'm actually coming at it from a slightly different angle and talking about how the meaning of the things that we care about in our lives are often what are prompting those emotions. So, for example, people tend to feel sad when they have lost something or they lack something, when a pet or someone we love dies. People also feel sad when they see that someone else has something that they don't, but they also might feel sad if they feel like, I can never get that because it's a loss or a lack. I don't know how to cook. I'm a horrible cook. My husband does all the cooking, which is great for me. But like, I'm not sad about that because I don't care. I don't feel sad that that's not something I can do because I have someone who can do it for me. And if he wasn't around, I would either learn to cook or I would eat a lot more takeout. And so if the thing that I've lost or lacked doesn't matter, I'm not going to have that feeling. But someone who feels sad that someone dies, that matters because that relationship mattered. That belonging, that intimacy that you had with that person, that's no longer there. And that's why we feel sad.
And then what about intensity? So if you and I valued the same thing, our emotional reaction to it, whether gaining it or losing it, could be completely different on an intensity scale. How does that play into this realm of value and meaning when it comes to emotions?
The two that come to mind are one is that people have individual differences in their kind of sensitivities to emotional stimuli. Emotions live in our brains and in our bodies, and some people are just more wired to be more attentive to threat or more attentive to reward. And people who are more sensitive to emotions just are going to experience things more strongly. And sensitivity isn't static. Like you talked about trauma earlier, right? Somebody who goes through a trauma, particularly if that trauma is unresolved, if it kind of lingers, people can increase in their emotional sensitivity over time through their actions. Trauma tends to come with a lot of avoidance. And when people avoid and they try to push that away, their sensitivity grows over time. So sensitivity is one piece. And the other piece is that how much they weight a given value is also going to change from person to person. You and I might both care about belonging, but we might care about it in different ways. But it might be more central to your identity than to mine. And if that's the case, then violations of belonging are going to affect you more than they're going to affect me.
And so when someone has a very strong reaction to something that happens, what can that tell them in that moment?
I think it tells them that something matters. I think that when people can have a curious attitude towards their emotions, they can learn more rather than sort of saying, I shouldn't. Just this week, I experienced this with one of my clients who had a pretty strong emotional reaction, was like, well, I shouldn't feel like that. It's like, because you think you shouldn't, you're probably going to be feeling it stronger and it's going to linger. People have what's called secondary emotions, which is you have an emotion about an emotion. So let's say someone feels angry, but they feel angry at their like elderly mother for forgetting to call when they were supposed to call. And they're like, oh, I shouldn't feel mad. She's old, but they feel violated. And then they feel anxious about the fact that they feel angry at a family member. So now we've compounded our emotions and we feel even stronger because we're having a feeling about a feeling. And that can cause problems in relationships, right? If somebody has a strong reaction and they end up yelling at the other person or running into the other room and shutting the door. Like I've had times where I've had feelings that felt like they came out of the blue. Like I've ended up crying in my office with students a couple of times. And I'm like, wait, what is this? I did not think this was going to happen. Am I crying because I'm angry? Like I'm a frustrated crier. So I cry when I feel like I can't express myself clearly. And so I'll be like, okay, where's this coming from? Like, what can I learn about myself? What is happening in this moment that is contributing to this strong reaction? And having some curiosity about that tends to reduce the shoulds and can make it more like an exploration, like an investigation, rather than feeling like you have to shut the door.
That is so well said. And, you brought up the topic of reacting to an emotion. And there's a lot of talk right now around regulation, but also feeling the emotion. And I feel like there's a ton of confusion around this. What does it mean to regulate an emotion, but also feel it, but not act out on it? And different words that get thrown around all the time. How do you define those different buckets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So feeling an emotion is that when an emotion takes place, that you're at least aware of it. You kind of know where it is in your body. You might be able to understand the intensity of it. So I often have my clients rate the intensity. So from 0 to 10 or 0 to 100. So that is the feeling of the emotion. To me, the reaction is the behavior. That is what is seen from the outside. And we just did a study, me and a couple of my grad students, on asking people to define what is emotional control. We were asking people, okay, how do you define emotional control? Is emotional control different from emotion regulation? About half of people said they were different, and about half of people said they were the same, which was very interesting.
Yeah.
And the people who said that they were different said they were different for all kinds of reasons, but namely that a lot of people thought about emotional control as broader, that to have emotional control, you also need to be kind of emotionally intelligent. You need to be aware of and be able to allow your feelings. And that for the most part, emotional control means not acting on your emotions. So like, let's say I'm angry at my kid because he doesn't go out the door fast enough. And so he misses the bus. And so I'm angry at that because if he would have just walked out the door 2 minutes earlier when he was supposed to, I wouldn't have had to drive him to school. I feel angry about that. But not reacting means not yelling or lashing out or behaving in a way that is going to harm my own impression of myself or the relationship. So a lot of people think about emotional control as restricting their behavioral responses, whether that's the expression of their emotion or really their actions. Whereas regulation is typically about trying to modulate your emotion in one way or another. So if I'm feeling anxious at a 9, regulation might be bringing that down to like a 4 or 5. And so regulation is about trying to change that emotion or trying to decrease the amount of an emotion that I'm feeling. So I think I might feel anxious inside and I don't want to react to that, meaning I don't want to snap at people. I don't want to seem like I'm physically shaking. I want to put on a good performance. So what I want to do is feel a little bit of that anxiety, because actually walking into a performance situation, when people are not anxious at all, they tend to be lazy and unfocused. But too much anxiety actually hurts performance. So then what I want to do is regulate down. So instead of being anxious at a 9 out of 10, I want to be anxious at about a 5. So I'm feeling it a little bit, I'm regulating, and I'm monitoring my behavior.
And so where does avoidance sit? And how would someone know that they're feeling it and regulating it versus I'm just avoiding it and pushing it down?
To be clear, avoidance is regulation. I'm doing some recent research on people using sleep as emotion regulation. So they're like, ooh, I don't feel good. I'm going to go home and I'm going to go to bed. In our research, we found that some people pursue sleep to try to turn off their feelings. I don't want to feel this anymore, and I'm going to go to sleep because when I'm sleeping, I'm not conscious, I'm turning it off. That's avoidance. Other people choose to sleep because they know that they're dysregulated and they know that sleeping will help them regain some mental clarity. And so they'll have better energy to come back to the problem on the next day. Same behavior, but the motivation is very different. One's an avoidance motivation, and one is sort of strategic delay, which is I'm delaying dealing with this feeling, but because I know that I'm not as capable now as I will be after I get some sleep. And people who do these different kinds of sleeping for emotion regulation have different outcomes. The people who are avoiding tend to have more symptoms of depression and anxiety. They tend to kind of be worse off, whereas the people who sleep in the strategic delay way, like that's an adaptive form of regulation or delay, even though it's the same behavior.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is that the intention behind it seems to be the differentiator when it comes to avoidance and then the delay.
Yeah, because when people are trying to avoid or push away their emotions, which you can do in kind of 2 different ways. If your emotion is sort of in the center of a sphere, you have kind of 2 ways. One is if you want to stay in that center of the sphere, you can try to throw your emotion away, or you can keep the emotion there and you can try to escape from it. So those are both forms of avoidance, trying to run away from your feelings. And either one of them could work in that they require regulation. You're trying to distance yourself from that emotion. That's a regulation. You're trying to get rid of that emotion that you're feeling that you don't want, that you think is toxic. So people do disengage. That is regulation. It just tends to be maladaptive when people use those kinds of strategies to push away or run away from their emotions too often. Because what do they teach themselves? This emotion is more powerful. It's stronger than me. I can't be in the same circle as this feeling. The implication is if I do, something bad will happen. Let's it affect their behavior in a way that harms them or harms their relationships. But a lot of times people learn when they engage in that avoidance, what they teach themselves is that they can't handle that feeling. And the more people think they can't handle that feeling, the more they're not going to handle it. And the more that snowballs into people having symptoms of all different kinds of disorders with lots of mental health problems.
Yeah, I can even see how they could adapt to it where they're avoiding situations or avoiding certain conversations, and it would snowball that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Are emotions ever actually wrong? Or is it just more about how we respond to them?
I think that's a subjective question. So my personal answer to it is that emotions are not wrong. Now, if I think about that, is it that an emotion is unhelpful? Well, yeah, emotions can be unhelpful. So anxiety is a great example that anxiety can be helpful, but anxiety also can produce avoidance, right? If somebody is like, I'm anxious about who's going to be at this party because I don't know how they're going to respond. Well, I'm just not going to go to the party. Then they miss out on the relationships that they could build, the fun that they could have if they were at the party. Anxiety prompts people to avoid this potentially dangerous or threatening thing. The problem is that sometimes our emotions are sending us messages that are as much based in the past or based in fears of what the future will be than the reality. Most likely, the worst thing that will happen at a party is that it will be awkward and uncomfortable for a little bit. And then people will settle into like talking to someone. It won't be as bad as we think. We tend to think that situations will be both worse and better than they actually are. That's a human kind of forecasting error.
You said something interesting about emotions are a lot of times tied or rooted in something that's happened to us in the past. But could you say that if you don't have an emotional reaction to a situation or something that someone says to you, that that's not something that has happened to you in the past, that you had a negative or even a positive experience toward?
So if someone doesn't have an emotional reaction,
Yeah. So let's take the party. I'm at the party. I'm not nervous to go. I have no awkwardness. So could it be said that I've never had an experience in the past where a party was awkward for me?
well, not necessarily, because we learn from experience. So if someone had been to a party and it was awkward, they'd be more likely to think that another party would be awkward. But
Hmm.
we can have expectations based on things besides our own experience, in part because people generally consume media, they observe others. So we've all seen a movie or a TV show where someone goes to a party and it's awkward. Human beings also have imagination. So someone might imagine themselves going to a party and everybody's staring at them. Even if they've never had an awkward situation at a party, they might anticipate it because of the story that they're telling themselves in their own mind. So
Mm.
experience does predict what people will feel, but it's not the only predictor because we have all these inputs to what we think is going to happen based on media consumption, modeling of what we've seen from caregivers, and then our own dreams and imaginations.
So we can literally imagine a situation and develop a feeling about it just based on that.
Yeah.
That's wild. And in your experience, how difficult is it for someone to change an emotion about an expectation or a certain situation?
Changing emotions is hard, but it's not impossible. So emotions come not from situations themselves. So we often think that, well, the movie was scary and therefore I felt fear. So that's actually inaccurate, because if you've ever been to a horror movie in a theater or watched it with a group of friends, like not everyone is scared. You're all watching the same
Mhm.
movie, but some people are like jumping out of their seats and other people have no reaction whatsoever. And you ask them and they're like, yeah, that was kind of boring. And other people think it is hilarious. And so we have different reactions to the same stimuli because of how we interpret those situations. So it's not that emotions come from situations, it's that the situation then prompts an interpretation in our mind. And that is what creates the emotional response. So, what that means is one of the ways to help combat or help change an emotion is try to think about the situation differently. When emotions become hard to change is when we get really caught up that our interpretation or expectation is correct. That this is what's going to happen. Like, this party will be horrible. And so getting people to reframe or sort of shift their interpretation, even just to soften it and saying it might be, but I don't know, it could also be pleasant. People need to start recognizing that, because we tend to get stuck in our interpretations as facts. And in reality, that's just not true. And if we can shift our interpretation or our reasons, our emotions can bend and shift a little bit too.
That's an interesting way of looking at it, because I feel like, especially just in my own experience with clients, someone can be so stuck, wrapped up in a certain emotion that it feels hard for them to change that expectation or maybe take a look at a different perspective. Is that something that you see with your clients, that the emotion is so powerful and has that hold on them? Is it that simple to be able to change that perspective, or does more regulation need to happen in conjunction with that?
I think a lot of times more regulation needs to happen. So emotions that are stronger, if we think about, like, I've been using this 0 to 10 scale, like at what level do you feel like you stop being able to think clearly? At what intensity do you feel like your thinking is impaired?
I would say like an 8.
Most people say somewhere between around a 7, somewhere between a 6 and an 8. And so the idea is that, and there's science to back this up, that when emotions are really intense, it is hard to think. Our interpretations feel right. So people are engaging in what we might call emotional reasoning. Because I feel this way, my thoughts about the situation are correct. Emotions narrow our thinking into the interpretations that we have. So when emotions are very intense, thinking about things a different way is just unlikely to work. So in that instance, we may want to regulate in another way, generally in ways that don't involve thinking, that involve behavior. So when my kid was really angry, I would have him hold an ice cube in his hand. People can sometimes splash water on themselves. I've had clients like suck on a lemon head or even do a headstand, something behavioral that kind of just shifts the moment for them a little bit. People even prefer distraction when their emotions are really strong so that they can let that emotion come back down. So that line, I call that the thinking threshold. Everyone has a different one. So if yours is an 8 and you were my client, if you were really agitated, I would try to bring your emotion down to maybe a 6. And then we would try to think of alternative explanations, because you're just not going to think of any when you're above that thinking threshold. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, and we've all been there where it's just like that pinpoint tunnel, and that is where we're going, and we're just trying to stop ourselves from entering the other side of that, which I would say is destructive or something that would hurt a relationship.
Yeah. And so then when the emotion comes back down a little, that's when we will engage in some reappraisal, kind of trying to reinterpret the situation. And people aren't always good at that either. So I find that working with clients or with myself, I might say, like, here's how I'm viewing the situation. But like, what if I had a friend who experienced the same situation and felt differently? What might they have thought in that moment that would get them to a different feeling? That generally helps a lot, because we know that people don't experience the same things that we do. So if we can take a second and step back and engage in some perspective taking, like someone else might have felt differently. So what kinds of thoughts would they have had? Simply going through the process of saying, it could be like this, actually can help people start to regulate, because when people feel more certain that their perspective is right, their emotions tend to be stronger and less bendable. So when we can think of how someone else might have experienced something, that tends to soften the intensity of the feeling.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about specific emotions and possibly the messages that they are sending to us. So for instance, if someone is feeling anger, what could they pull from that and start to get curious about? What kind of questions would they ask? Or if it's fear, what would that look like? Can you dive into some specific emotions that you look at all the time for people?
Yeah. So different emotions come with different kind of messages, that content of that message, right? And so anger is about an injustice or unfairness. So when someone feels angry, like someone's cut off in traffic, it's like they're an asshole, right? That feels unfair. They shouldn't have done that to me. And so when someone feels angry, it's like, okay, well, what was unfair? What was unjust? Often there's a rule that someone has when they feel angry about the way the world is supposed to be that has been violated. So that's a question they can ask. Fear and anxiety are closely related. So fear is about something dangerous is happening to me right now. And anxiety is about something dangerous could happen in the future. And so when people feel fear is a very adaptive response, because people feel fear often in times where there is a legit threat. If a woman's walking alone at night, she might feel scared because people get assaulted. We don't want that to happen. So having some fear makes sense. But anxiety, people often feel that things are threatening in the future that aren't actually threatening. So asking yourself, what is a threat? Is this actually dangerous? Or is something in my system just telling me that it might be dangerous? Sadness is about a loss or a lack. Guilt is about, I've done something wrong. And so when someone feels guilty, the question is, what did you do that was wrong? There's rules there too. That's sort of like something moral or ethical. So people can ask themselves that. Shame is, I think, probably the emotion that is the least useful of all the feelings, because guilt says I've done something wrong. Shame is I am wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And no one is wrong as a person. We all make wrong decisions. We all screw up. We might hurt someone's feelings. We might do things that are against our own best interests. We might have regret. We might have guilt. Those things can help us get back on track, kind of repair our relationships, but shame doesn't. Shame is self-focused, and that tends to perpetuate sort of rumination and other kinds of negative emotions. So I would say when people feel shame, to see if they can pivot that into something a little bit more productive, like guilt or sadness or anger, which are feelings that do give better messages about how they're responding to the world.
And so when you're working with clients and they're able to actually name what they're feeling in that specific emotion, what do you prompt them from there to do? Are there specific questions for each emotion that you would take that client through, or that they could explore on their own to understand it a little bit more?
Yeah, it would depend on the situation. If someone's feeling guilty, I might say, okay, well, what did you do that was wrong? And sometimes the answer is like, oh, nothing. So we might talk through the thoughts that are underneath that feeling to see if they even make sense. And a lot of times those judgments crumble when you evaluate them. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes people feel guilty because they legit did something wrong. And so then it's like, then that feeling is telling you that you've acted against your own moral compass. What do you want to do about that? Do you want to apologize? Do you want to change your behavior moving forward? How do you want to take that message for growth without getting stuck in it? People can ruminate around guilt and around regret and remorse in ways that don't help them move forward and just keep their wheels spinning in the mud. And so if somebody really did do something that they feel guilty about and that guilt makes sense to them, then it's about how to use that to go forward. And if they have trouble doing that, then we try to regulate. It's complicated, right?
Yeah, but it's such an important thing to do within yourself, is to go here. And it's so easy to get into that. I don't want to feel that. I want to avoid that. And that kind of brings us back to this idea of suppression and avoiding. When we avoid emotions, what happens when they come back louder?
First, it's important to note that they do come back louder. In my classes, in my book, I often talk about the example from the first Harry Potter book, where Harry Potter gets a message from Hogwarts saying you're a wizard. His uncle takes it and throws it in the fire. And then the next day, more letters come. And then eventually, a few days later, the house is completely flooded with letters because that letter was determined to be received. Well, emotions are basically like that too. Emotions are messages from our own brains, from our own values to ourselves. So we're going to get it. It's just a question of when. So you push that emotion away, it's going to have to get louder. You know, someone rings the doorbell, they're going to ring it 100 times to try to get your attention. Pushing the emotion away helps the current moment because you might not have to deal with it, but it actually screws over your future self because it makes the emotion stronger, and your future self is not inherently more strong to be able to deal with that. And so then you end up in this vicious cycle. And the solution is, of course, that you feel some of the feeling, and then the emotion doesn't have to get as strong.
And I feel like a common thought, I know you've said these are not opposites, this idea of rumination. So a lot of people think on one side, I could avoid it. And a lot of people think on the other side, well, if I don't avoid it, I'll ruminate and I'll get stuck in that cycle. What do you say to that?
Well, rumination and avoidance actually tend to go together. So people who do one often do both. Worry and rumination actually can perpetuate avoidance. So people think about the feelings so that they don't have to feel them. It's kind of like if thoughts are the head and emotions are the heart, people try to think their way out of the feelings. If I worry about this, if I try to figure out why this happened, then that will make the emotion go away. I can avoid the feeling if I focus on the thought. No, it doesn't work. So when people worry and they ruminate, they actually tend to perpetuate the feeling. They tend to make it stronger. So by the way, does venting. venting in emotion doesn't help because it's co-rumination. You basically, what you want to do in that instance is you want your friend to be like, that other person sucks. And you're like, yeah, they do. And then you like amp each other up and people feel worse for longer. So rumination and worry and venting all perpetuate these emotions, but they may perpetuate them at a slightly lower level so that they don't feel quite as bad or quite as strong. They also serve a bit of an avoidance function.
That's so interesting because when you vent in that moment, it does feel really good. But you're saying that that actually keeps you stuck in that feeling longer.
Well, it depends. So it is very helpful to share feelings with others. So venting from that lens is useful. Emotions are designed to be expressed, they're designed to bring people together. If what you mean by venting means to like get my emotions off my chest and kind of share them with somebody, that's not inherently bad. What's bad is when the venting doesn't involve any kind of listening to yourself. People can talk about loud, and when they hear themselves, they're like, I sound wild. And they use the speaking as a way to hear themselves and thus as a way to shift their perspective and regulate. People who are venting and just want other people to like agree with them and only want validation and only want people to kind of like get on their side, that tends to not be helpful because there's no perspective taking. There's no listening. There's no learning. There's just sharing and just kind of commiseration, which might feel better in the moment, but it doesn't prompt any kind of growth.
That makes sense. So for people listening, when an emotion hits, how do you help people create a pause between the feeling and reacting to that feeling?
The first thing I say is that's a skill that you can't just do immediately. It takes practice. So people ask me, okay, if you had to pick only one like emotional skill, what is the most important thing that you would teach? My answer is usually emotional labeling. So the reason why labeling is so important is that when people put a word to their emotion and they're like, okay, I'm feeling anxious, you're kind of telling yourself what the message of that emotion is. Labeling actually does a whole bunch of cool things in your brain. So when people put a name to their emotion, their brain actually registers that and sort of starts to downregulate, and your brain starts to calm down. So labeling actually starts the regulation process. When people name their feelings, they tend to get better. So you name it to tame it. So some of what I like to talk to people about is like creating that pause between action and reaction. Well, if you're in an argument with somebody and somebody says something and you kind of snap back at them, there isn't a pause there. So what you have to do is after that conflict, when you kind of think back about, okay, what did I feel? So what emotion was I experiencing at that moment? And name it afterward, because the more you practice labeling and naming, what am I feeling right now? The more that becomes easier to do in those moments when you actually need it. I like to think of labeling as what I call an emotional conditioning skill, right? You're a trainer. And so that's sort of strength training and conditioning, and athletes have to condition their bodies before a game. You do all the things to condition your body so that in those moments of time, your body's ready. Well, emotions work the same way. And so labeling is a really important emotional conditioning skill that when you have it and can recognize, even in the back of your mind, like, oh, I'm starting to get angry right now. Okay. Then people can introduce a little bit more of a pause before they react.
I love how you called out looking at a situation where maybe you didn't act the way that you wanted to. You were reacting to that emotion, but then taking apart that emotion and trying to piece by piece look at, okay, this is what they said. Here's how I felt from that, and almost dissecting it. And I think that's so valuable. And it's not something that we feel comfortable doing all the time. We kind of just want to like avoid it and move on and go on to the next moment. But I just want to call out how important that is. So when you get into that next situation, you're more aware, you can catch things and you know, okay, this is what's happening right now.
Yeah, it would be great if there was some magic pill or trick that suddenly people would have more space in the interactions that they're having in their moments to not just react. But it doesn't work like that. You have to practice at it. It's a way to start training yourself to be able to respond differently. Yeah.
So for someone listening who wants a healthier relationship with emotions, where would you say is the best place that they could start right after listening to this episode?
I would go with labeling. So one of the things that I might do is go to my phone and go to the Apple Store or the Google Play Store, and I would download the How We Feel app, which is a fantastic app that uses emotion science and helps people label their emotions. And so what I like about it is that it starts easy. You basically have to say, am I feeling good or bad? Am I feeling activated or sluggish? And you just pick a quadrant, and then it gives you a bunch of words to choose from and defines them. And so that is probably the first place that I would start. And it's helpful because the app, you can set it up to notify you like 3 times a day. You can also prompt in if you have a situation. It prompts you to ask yourself some of those questions. What happened? What was I thinking? What was I feeling? So do that retrospective that we just talked about. Oh, and buy my book.
Of course. And how has this work changed your relationship with your own emotions?
I think I am way more emotionally aware than I used to be. I also feel much more friendly towards my emotions than I used to be. I definitely used to be on more team avoidance or try to stuff the feeling down. So since I started studying emotions, I've been much more emotionally open. So when a student cries in my office, I might cry with them and I might feel okay about it. If I show emotion in class, sometimes I will actually stop and be like, okay, I'm feeling something right now. And I'll talk out loud about it because as a professor, I like to model my feelings. Same thing goes with my kids or my family. We showed up to a hotel and we'd been driving for like 8 hours. We really wanted to go to this like happy hour at the hotel. And we got there and I had booked the hotel for the wrong month. And I was so mad at myself and I was frustrated and they didn't have any other rooms and I didn't know what we were going to do. And I just like sat there in the lobby and cried. And my kids were like, what's happening here? And my husband was like, is there anything you can do? I'm like, no, I got to feel my feelings. Like, I'm going to figure it out. But right now, I'm like in my feels. I'm feeling frustrated and overwhelmed. And I'm just going to let myself have these feelings. And you know what? They passed and it was okay. And so I am much more open to letting myself have feelings and letting them show because I think that we do way too much hiding of our emotions. A lot of people think that they shouldn't burden other people with their emotions. Well, guess what? I don't think other people's emotions are a burden. I think other people's emotions are a window into who they really are and into what matters. And so if I really believe that, and I do, then I have to be willing to put my money where my mouth is and show some of my emotions to other people and be willing when they're uncomfortable with my emotions to call that out and to potentially regulate because I don't want to like distress other people unnecessarily. So it's a dance, but I find that I'm constantly kind of trying out the things that I'm learning from my research and from my reading on myself as well as with my clients.
So speaking of your research, what are you exploring next? And what do you see as the next evolution of this work?
So I'm really interested in trying to find ways that people can allow their emotions without trying to push them away. So I'm working right now on a big grant-funded project where we're trying to increase people's willingness to sit with uncomfortable emotions, as well as trying to find ways to increase people's self-efficacy. So people's feeling like I can handle this, like I can do this. I'm also trying to understand these ideas of emotional control. I think people find some emotions easier than others. I'm trying to understand what feelings do people tend to struggle with the most in terms of being able to allow and why. And we're at the very beginning stages of that research, but it's pretty interesting because people haven't really looked at that before. But I think that there may be some pretty interesting patterns in terms of the feelings that people find that they can take and the ones that they tend to push away, and what that says about who they are as a person and what that might mean for different forms of treatment.
Those are huge questions.
Yeah.
You're going to have to come back on and let us know what you find because that is fascinating. And Dr. Veilleux, thank you so much for joining us today. You've given us a lot to think about. And I think you just hit home the message about how emotions are so important to understand. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Beyond 80%. Make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an opportunity to learn, question, and evolve. If you enjoyed this episode, the best way to support the show is to share it with someone in your circle, a friend, a colleague, anyone who's ready to think a little deeper. Until next time, I'm your host, Ryan Olekson, and this is Beyond 80%.